Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh.
On the show today, Christopher Cooke. So Chris Cooke is associated with Spiral Dynamics. He's a senior manager, consultant, been a change agent for over 20 years. Had a background in engineering before that, master's degree in managing change. I met him, I think, for the first time at the Integral Conference, where we had Benser and Roger Walsh and Ken Wilber, other people associated with that movement. And I think very highly of him. So Christopher, it's nice to have you on the show today.
Mark, it's a delight to be on, and I think highly of you as well. Yes, it was last year at the European Integral Conference that we met, and we just clicked, and I've been looking forward to having this call with you.
Yeah, it's nice to catch up. Sometimes listeners don't know this, but sometimes it's just a way of catching up with friends or potential new friends. This whole thing. Okay, so at the beginning, how did you get interested in the body? What was your journey with that before we come to some of your specialisms?
Interest in the body was how to interpret the messages, the subtle whispers, I describe it, that my body was giving me. In my early career, I was working with biological systems, wastewater treatment, and so on. And that brought me into close contact with the microbiome. So it was trying to interpret what the information was, the subtle information I was receiving that was really showing in my body before in my mind that led me into my interest in the biological form.
Okay, and I mean you're known for your work with Spiral Dynamics, so maybe we should just go straight in there and ask what that is.
Spiral Dynamics is a useful model to help us understand human stage development. Originally, the primary research started in 1950s, went through to 1978, and was followed by field trials in South Africa. Don Beck, Chris Cowan popularized the work through Spiral Dynamics. And very useful piece of work that Ken Wilber came across in 1998. And I was in on that conversation with Ken at the time. And what Ken didn't know, he was actually one of the research subjects of the original researcher, Clare Graves, and Don Beck carried on that tradition and was tracking the development of Ken in those early days. And that's what led to the contact in 98. Which then led to what became known as Spiral Dynamics Integral. So I've worked with this since 97 and taken it further, brought in a range of other points of view that are very useful in this work. But I've differentiated myself through application. So I became very curious about how to apply this, and I was an engineer stroke manager in the water industry when I first came across this work. And it was application in that context, and then in as many contexts as I could find that's differentiated my work to date.
Great, and I'd point listeners to episodes with Benson Ganti, Benson Roger Walsh, Ken Wilber we had on, of course, and there's a sort of fun one with me and Keith Martin-Smith go through various levels of development in our own sort of crude way. So rather than sort of make you go through all the basics, I'd sort of ask listeners to sort of listen to some of those basics as to what a stage development model is and the different sort of color schemes.
Mark, could I the one important thing I'd like to suggest is that the aspect that differentiates my work from most of the conversations around this is that, yes, we do need to understand the full spectrum of stages, the full spectrum of consciousness and how that impacts. But most importantly, what Graves highlighted that was then reinforced through the later research around Spiral Dynamics was that there's a major leap, there's a major shift in thinking, which today is really a move into a more integral, holistic awareness. And it's that domain that I've really specialized in, learning how to observe it, track it, nourish it, nurture it, and release the capability. And that I think is probably one of the nuggets to hold on to in this conversation.
Okay, so what does that look like? How do you track it? How does this show up for you, this shift?
Well, in terms of the shift, if you're looking for it, it's difficult to spot at one level because it doesn't reveal itself. The individual who's in this transition normally keeps quite a low profile because their thinking is so different. But you can spot it in two ways. if you go and look for stressed situations, stress life conditions, you'll always find some individuals who are upstretching. They're stretching up. Their consciousness is lifting their awareness to handle the complexity. So, for example, the 30-year drought in Australia was where I went to go and seek the innovators that could work with the more subtle aspects of microbiome, plant and animal work, because fundamentally conventional agriculture failed. So that's one way to spot it, is to go and look for the stress life conditions and go and look for the innovators within it. The other thing to look out for is innovation, or individuals whose point of view and their solutions are so elegantly simple they completely outperform the present paradigm. And that's led me to really coin a phrase that, if we're looking for change, I'm not really interested in the 2, 3, 4, 5% conversation. I'm looking for factor 50 plus change. And that, for example, in our work with soil today, means that we look for factor 50 improvement in carbon sequestration in soil by using very simple natural processes that allow nature's processes to do their work. So 2 ways of looking for it, and some insights into the sort of things you can look out for.
Okay. Can you give us some more examples of how this shows up, this integral consciousness, as it were? And I'm also interested in this idea of life conditions, because that seems to be part of spiral dynamics that's not always talked about.
Okay, so if you go back to the original Graves' point of view, it was, and here, this is the full description of it. It's described as the emergent cyclical double helix of adult, bio, psycho, cultural, social systems development. So that's the link through to your interest around embodiment, is that in the consciousness is carried and represented, accessed and stimulated through the bio, through the psycho, through the cultural and the social system. So there's this very holistic appreciation that you can enter the particular stage of development, that holonic field, let's call it that, through directly through the biological, the psychological, the cultural, or the social context or environment. That really is the way to bring in the life conditions. But most importantly, Mark, the life conditions are the first helix. They are the primary determinant of how the individual responds to the life conditions. So if you're familiar with epigenetics and the way in which we know that our genes respond to the environment, what Graves' original work and what spiral dynamics continued and embellished was an appreciation that there is a psychosocial DNA-like interaction between the all and our biological and psychological selves.
Okay, and what's the bodily aspect of this then, to kind of bring it to maybe one of the kind of core interests of listeners?
Well, the bodily aspect means that all aspects of the biological self, the appreciation of the somatic, it is really characterized by the reality that within us are representations and echoes and patterns of all the processes that have been created over the last 14 billion years. So one of the popular phrases might be that we're the universe in a human skin. So it means that within us and through our biological form, we can not only access an impression of universe, but also we can influence universe. So our biological form is our own local life conditions at one level, and we can intervene, work with, embellish, shape up, and act up through the biological form, which provides access to all other aspects, all other lines of development that you're familiar with. And that's why it's important.
Okay, and there is this different orientation to the body that's quite obvious at different levels of development, right? Some seeing it as a danger, sinful, some as a machine, some as something to be expressed. There's a different evolution of how the body is related to.
Yeah. And so there's different perspectives, different third-person perspectives of the biological form. But I think most importantly, what in our conversation tonight, and what differentiates spiral dynamics and the Graves technology, it was the first work back in the 60s that was postulating and demonstrating a biochemical change to our psychology. And that's been borne out over time. So it's the patterns of how the biological form changes, how the psychological form changes, and how we relate to our physical form that's significant. But in our social work, for example, we know now that certain stages of development have, as I said, different neurochemical forms, different neuroreceptors. So if we're tracking and understanding the change dynamics in a culture, if we know what the recreational drugs of choice are, we've got a good clue as to what the active stage of development is in a particular context. So, for example, the center of gravity of red in spiral dynamics, that will be the power god. That's associated with the crack cocaines. Alcohol would be associated with the truth force, with color code blue in spiral dynamics. Cocaine would be more associated with orange, with the strive drive, enterprise self. The cannabis and the softer drugs would be associated with the more humanistic self, green, etc., etc. And so that's how, in the work on spiral dynamics, we're always considering the biological form at a multiplicity of scales. What came to mind to finish that sentence was really it's our appreciation through our body of the significance of universe from quark to cosmos. Now, you asked me about how I got into this, why I was interested in the biological form. It was about 35 years ago. I was working with some very advanced biological treatment of very heavy industrial waste. And the natural processes working with reeds and certain types of grasses, they completely outperformed anything that was going on in the technical, more chemical domain, which was tending to be popularized at that time because you could make a lot of money out of it. But it was realized that reed beds, and you were understanding how plants relate to and the soil around them, you could actually create treatment processes that completely outperform anything on the planet. And they're extensively used today. And I remember taking the innovator on one side and saying, look, how do you measure this? And he just quite looked around to make sure no one was listening. He turned to me and he said, remember, Christopher, he said, the most sensible instrument in the universe is the human body. And it was that set me on the journey, Mark, that not only it was teaching me to work with the very subtle dynamics of the physical form. So that's been part of my experimentation and growing appreciation over the years from many of the practices that you work with right the way through to just being able to be bathed by information in the fermentation room to squeeze every ounce out of the information that one receives in biological or physical form.
Okay, let's go back to the drug use thing. So I've never heard that before. That's something I've never heard in any kind of discussion of development. So you're saying there's a different biochemistry, the different stage of development, so they kind of self-medicate it with different things.
Well, yes. I mean, the use of recreational drugs is really the mind's attempt to fill the gaps in the life conditions. So this whole understanding of the motivational flow of a human being. Don Beck's favorite phrase would be that the mind is smarter than we are. So that the mind creates this context, this field effect in which we thrive biologically, psychologically, and so on. And if the life conditions are out of alignment, and that can be internal or external life conditions, so malnutrition, for example, can be cause a problem, the individual may well be prone to taking on a recreational more approach, using a recreational substance to offset the gap of something that they really need in the life conditions. And this brings a whole new conversation to the use of recreational drugs right the way through to the management of addiction.
So give us an example of take one of those, say, I don't know, orange meme, City of London, Coke heads. Like, how does the cocaine fill a need there?
Well, the core pattern or core code of Orange is winning the game, and if the game becomes increasingly competitive, highly stressful, the use of the cocaine can keep the individual in upstretch within that what I call the center of gravity of Orange that keeps them stimulated. So they move into more of an illusionary dynamic where it keeps them on the edge. It keeps them center of gravity. It stimulates that particular center of gravity and keeps them in that domain where they believe they are most fulfilled. But obviously, you hear many stories in that domain around burnout and so on and so forth. So the biological form, the neurochemical form, can only sustain that very high level of stimulation for a period of time. And what then tends to happen, and this is where there's a predictive capability in the Graves technology and spiral dynamics, that once they get to that burnout, you can predict what is next naturally for them. So the exiting out of Orange, the massive sense of loneliness as they start to make the transition into a more humanistic core self.
It's interesting you talk about this predictive nature of spiral dynamics. Like, I've heard predictions made about different countries, for example, and where they might be heading.
Yeah, it was a maxim of Clare Graves, and I'll cover this in two ways because we work with farmers in the successional dynamics of ecology. So Graves realised that he was tapping into an understanding of the really primary successional dynamics of human emergence. So his work was very fundamental. It's not just a question of stages, which often gets reduced to a typology. It was an understanding of the core patterns, the habituated patterns of the universe, as Ken would describe, that speak through us, that flow through us, that depending on our context and state of being, shows itself, reveals itself in a particular center of gravity of a particular stage of development. So it's the transcend and include this dynamic, this pattern, this flow of stages is well understood. Yes, there are biases and so on and patterns that one can be aware of, but fundamentally, the trajectory of evolution or involution is largely known. So if you know what the center of gravity of a particular individual is, and you know if their life conditions lead to satiation and full expression of motivational flow, it naturally leads predictably to the transition to what may be next naturally. So Graves' maxim would be an individual can only become what he or she next naturally may become, and equally that applies to culture, which then translates into any scale of human engagement. You find the same dynamics mapped I'm looking out here at the fields across the road. We now teach farmers, land and livestock managers to read the successional dynamics of the land. So these patterns, these successional dynamics, the patterns left behind after this creative evolutionary dynamic has done its work, is common to all biological forms. So many of your listeners will actually be not only responding to the particular impression of themselves and universe through their physical form, but also they're picking up the change dynamics, the weak signals from their future, the echoes from their past, and the major messages from their current existence.
Okay, so the concrete example there might be the business guys working in the cities, pursuing excellence, pushing himself hard for success, and he hits a burnout and says, you know what, I'm going to go traveling and do some yoga. And there's like another side of him that emerges that's kind of pretty predictable based on that current direction.
Yeah. So obviously that transition, and as you just rightly identified, there's a particular pattern you can observe. But it's often at that stage, certainly in that orange through green towards yellow transition, that this work around stage development becomes really important. because these stages are not self-inspectable until really exiting green and beyond. So through teal or yellow and beyond, as based on spiral dynamics or the Wilberian colours. And so this work really holds the mirror up to give the mind access to something that the individual can't self-inspect. And the mind just starts to make sense of that which was previously unconscious. So then it can become over time, a conscious act of really choosing to co-evolve with universe. And that's really the domain that I've operated in and explored, because it tends to be an area that's overlooked in society. We don't educate for it. We don't legitimize it. Anyone who asks, really hard questions tends to be ostracized. And this is why I really appreciate, Ken Wilber's work, because there's a lot of work going on around shadow and the understanding of that. But probably the greatest and most significant aspect of shadow work is the underutilized latent capacity of what's next naturally for an individual. And that's really the area that I've focused on.
So up till this integral stage of development, it's not self-aware. There's just people in a certain mindset, and it's like from their point of view, they're right. And there isn't a sense that there is an evolution happening or that there's a next step. It's just, this is, how the world looks from this point of view.
Yeah. So they're in the first tier. They're very driven by the bandwidth and by the biases of the particular worldview that's speaking through them. And the transition into what Graves described as second tier, this is totally aligned with Ken, transition to second tier, is that they move from human doing to human being. It's a transition to literally they're learning to be aware that everything is an I choose to. And that links back then nicely into the enhanced appreciation of working with the biological, psychological, cultural, and environmental aspects of being.
Do you think you can see these kind of stages of development in terms of like how people move or their relaxation levels? I mean, I have a sort of intuitive sense of that. Is that something that's part of this body of work or not so much?
Well, you just mixed two modalities there. In terms of seeing, you have to be cautious because you cannot tell from from movement what you can get some clues, but you cannot correlate directly what you see on the surface with the underlying stages of development. What you bring into it in the conversation is a much higher level of awareness, because your intuitive self is scanning, not just is taking information in from a biological form, but you're taking information in a much more subtle form that probably together with what you hear, feel, taste, and so on is actually giving you a good intuitive sense. So you just brought in two modalities there, and there's a big distinction between the two. But no, this is not a typology. And this is why in the emergence of second tier, anything that focuses on the behavioral diagnostic tends to run into problems. And I think certainly around autism, ADHD, etc., this is where we're starting to see some misplaced diagnosis. Because what many people don't realize is that the transition to second tier, certainly into early stage integral, is it releases an autistic learning style. So it's the natural, innate learning style of the individual. But very often, because of our life conditions, the contamination in our environment and so on, the biological form can be in a slight phase lag behind that psychological leap. And it takes time for this being to learn to utilize their new mind.
Say more about this autistic learning style, or ADHD is something I have a particular interest in personally. What do you mean? Again, I've never heard this before. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you track through the stages from, I'm going to use spiral dynamics, and that overlaps with Ken's, and most of your listeners will be ambidextrous, so they work with both. But if you go back about 120,000 years ago, there was probably one worldview that was active within our species, no sense of self. And it's very much an autistic learning style, taking information in solely from the senses, and at that stage, very unconscious awareness, but basically information from the senses in a much greatly amplified form than we experience today. So in that transition, blue-orange, for example, the senses become modulated. And what was found in the original research in the transition from green to yellow, this autistic learning style reappeared, but also it was accompanied by a significant enhancement of the sensory acuity of the individual. So the individual starting to learn how to utilize a much broader bandwidth of information than they've ever been experienced using before. And this is why that transition from orange through green and beyond, it can be often challenging because it literally is the individual learning to reintegrate all previous forms of humanness into a new form that provides the platform for the next phase of their journey. So it's a big integration.
So what comes with that? A sense of sort of overwhelm, or being hit with too much information? Like times I've been on meditation retreat, and it's just felt like all my senses have been leveled up, and I can hear the tap dripping from the other room, and in a social interaction, I'm aware of all these tiny micro movements of the facial muscles, and it's quite a lot to handle.
There's a lot to handle, but as you said, with time, with practice, you can learn to not only observe but also to experience the subtle changes within and within your own biological domain. So yeah, it's a practice. You don't just go to bed one night and wake up the next day with a whole new worldview. It's especially this second tier transition. It's one that I believe fervently the life conditions are now there that demand this way of thinking, especially because it's that the intelligence is so aligned with the need for life to continue on this planet, but also because of their enhanced sensory capability, they can really feel, Mark, that fragility of Earth.
Mm. I was just discussing with guest Betsy Politan, who's visiting me, about how things now seem more postmodern, more fluid, more unstable, more uncertain, the degree of change. No one's certain about gender, no one's certain about where their paycheck's coming from in a year or two's time. The life conditions seem to be incredibly fluid right now. There's a degree of complexity and ambiguity that hasn't existed before.
Yes, and that's as a consequence of two things. It's a consequence of the excess and dominance of a very mechanistic game playing transition, which was largely orange, because when that goes to excess, it dominates nature basically. But this postmodern shift is the individual and the collective are struggling because they're trying to work out the inner change. And in that transition, in that particular stage of development, there is not the capacity to handle the complexity. That really doesn't emerge until the transition into yellow or teal. And then the individual can start to look back in, experience the patterns, and learn to work with nature's process. So it's a shift from a chemical counter biology perspective of life to how do we holistically engage the processes of this planet, which reveal themselves through all life forms. So it is a big leap. But there are many who've successfully made it, and one of the magnificent joys for me of this work is I never know what to expect next. You can find well-documented first-person reflections on the emergence of holism from the 1920s, and then you look for the students of those early works, and you go and find those who are out there working with nature's processes and not with nature as a chemistry set. And so that's really where I've been focusing because of my involvement with a lot of work in agriculture, and how when nature's systems fall over through abuse, largely through technology, how did individuals discover the subtlety of these processes? And it's largely through their feet, Mark, as you would know. They learn to sense nature's processes through the biological form. and use that as the guide, and to develop trust in their own new knowing, so they can leave behind many of the technologies, many of the chemicals that cause the problems in the first place.
You talked about some of the sort of misunderstandings of developmental theory here. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that as it's becoming more popular. And I think starting with Ken Wilber and now spreading. Ken's been on my friend Dave Fuller's channel, for example, which is Intellectual Dark Web channel. It's these ideas are starting to get out there. And I see people sort of throwing colors around like monkeys throwing feces, and there's this, I think my own understandings of these things are pretty simple. So what are some of the main misunderstandings you hear of this field?
Okay, well, it often gets this whole body of knowledge, the stage development conversation gets reduced to a typology, or it gets reduced to a conversation around value systems. And in the original work, the research back in the 70s, 1974, for example, Graves warned people. He said, look, that if you focus on value systems, you're focusing on less than 10% of what my work's about. But obviously, it was a challenge even in those days, even today, to communicate the understanding of this psychosocial DNA-like interaction between our species and universe. So the reduction of these points of view to something that we use to improve performance and productivity without really using the understanding to upstretch and reshape our appreciation of how to coexist on Earth, and largely our purpose around our work in 3LN and 5 Deep is primarily how to contribute to a viable planet and a viable species. And Graves would say, look, this is not, the stress and the complexity is high, but that actually is going to stimulate a creative leap. That creative leap in our psyche has been showing itself through the research for the last 100 years. It's only a matter of time before it hits critical mass. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek because you can never be certain where creative evolution is involved. But what is true is that these capacities are there. Individuals like Ken and all the authors that he was tracking simultaneously were picking up the weak signals. And now's the time for these conversations, Mark, to help people move beyond the initial simplistic interpretation to really use every aspect of their being to discover what lays on the other side of the complexity, because there's an elegant simplicity waiting, and that's why I love to work with you, because through your work and the fun and enjoyment you bring to this, you can quickly access the elegant simplicity. And what I'm saying is, beyond that, provide individuals with the ability to cognitively lead into an understanding of these patterns within them. So it expands the repertoire, expands their bandwidth, and builds on everything that you're doing today.
And there is this idea that people cognitively understand this before they fully embody it, right?
Well, that's basically our knowing or meaning-making process. Obviously, by the time we come to know it in the early stages, there's an awful lot gone on before then. Universe has been speaking through us, and we haven't been able to pull it all together. What I think is a significant challenge and opportunity. It's a challenge to many, but the primary opportunity is that once the cognitive line has got a grasp of this, it can choose to utilize all forms of our existence, information from all sources, to inform our choices. And when that happens, the choices handle the complexity. And the challenge in the early days is that the individual can be coming with questions that he or she alone cannot answer. And so that then starts the next quest to find others who've got this appreciation, this sense of knowing that they've each got different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, as it were, to bring together the next collective intelligence that can truly handle some of these issues.
I'm not sure I get it, Chris, if I'm honest. Like, when you say it's not a typology, make that distinction for me a bit clearer. I'm not having a particularly clever day here.
Okay. Well, another way to think of it is that, and I mean, let's use some of Ken's nomenclature just to make it easy. Integral spirituality brought in the concept of the cosmic address of the being. Okay, so that means that the first signals, the first impressions of the universe that speak through us are really influenced by the stage the stage. They are reflected by the stage of development that's active within the being. And it's never one, it's always a cluster of 2, 3 as the center of gravity. And then obviously you've got different perspectives. First person perspective will give a much more body-centered experience of that particular stage. A third person will be third person perspective associated. But that's the primary intelligence that has not yet expressed a behavioral form. So the lines of development will then give us particular contextual abilities and capacities. So it might be a strength in our biological line of development that then links to our state of being, waking, sleeping, dreaming, or whatever state you choose to consider. But then the behavioral aspect tends to show itself with a certain pattern, and that's the typology. So the typology is very much the last thing to reveal itself, but it may or may not reflect the from an external point of view, an understanding of the primary intelligence that's at play within that individual center of gravity.
And just for listeners, can you explain center of gravity, because that's a term they may not have heard?
Okay, so in this spectrum of stage development, an individual will be stabilized around 1 or 2 particular stages of development. So we've used the ladder from beige through purple, red, blue, orange, green, yellow or teal, and then turquoise and beyond, because we're not finished. This pattern is still ongoing. So an individual will never be centralized in just one. So it might be an individual with center of gravity orange with an upstretch towards green and a downstretch towards blue. And those 3 together coalesce to form the individual center of gravity. When the individual's stressed, they might downstretch towards a much more authoritarian or one right way perspective, or they can equally upstretch into a much more humanistic sense. So an individual has many psychologies that morph and are shaped by the life conditions in which they find themselves. But you tend to revolve around a particular center of gravity. So it's like one of these skittles with a weight in the bottom. You can knock the skittle over and it picks itself up. So it's fundamentally, we can be moved, buffeted, stimulated by the life conditions, but fundamentally we're rooted around a particular center of gravity, even though temporarily we can upstretch, downstretch, or morph into expressions of what's next or what was previous. Excuse me.
Yeah, I think the sort of embodiment people often look at state quite a lot. And I think that's understressed by more developmental theorists. You know, I never saw someone at Green with a gun to their head, you know. It's this, the kind of, can you say a bit about that difference between sort of state and stage in this way, that people can seem to quite radically like get a bit stressed and then drop down into sort of red-blue operating, yet be at a much higher level of development themselves?
Well, remember that that sense of stress is information that's derived from the adaptive, the complex adaptive intelligences within them. These stages of development, what they experience, that state shift, that stress, or the dissonance they're experiencing, is a consequence of the movement of those inner intelligences, and that's another way to differentiate from type. So we're always bombarded from messages of adaptation, and each stage of development, for example, both if you look back over the last 120,000 years of human stage development, each transition as it formed in our species, because if you go back 120,000 years, there was only base, there was no other stage. And then as life conditions changed, in the early days, natural life conditions, ice ages, you name it, and then as population increased and we started to develop civilization, we start to create local life condition changes that stimulated us in new ways. As a new stage developed in our species, now it was probably a pattern in the universe waiting to be expressed through the biological form. So we just kind of picked up this next wave and translated it into the human form of it. In the transition from beige to purple, for example, the capacity for fear emerged. In the transition from purple to red, the capacity for anger emerged. So not all of the emotional capacities, the earlier driven sensors and the emotions that go with it, there are times when those didn't exist. So I can go through beige to purple, fear, purple to red, anger, red to blue, the emergence of guilt. So prior to the emergence of blue, about 5,000 years ago, there was no capacity for guilt in our species. That capacity, that neurochemical, neurobiological capacity just did not exist. From blue to orange, it was frustration. Orange to green, loneliness, and green to yellow, it's a strong binding sense of stuckness or cloying. It's like a sickly sticking together. And then exiting yellow is as far as we know at the moment, but that's largely a state of confusion. So these patterns and working with the body, these emotional states, give you clues as to where the adaptation is occurring within and between these stages of development, which neurochemical responses, which adaptive intelligences are morphing and change, not to provide you with clues of problems to be fixed, but really are echoes of the invitation from your future that's learning to overcome many of the barriers that have been built up over the previous lifespan. So that's one of the big lessons for me in working with this green to yellow transition, is that the challenge of focusing on, say, anger management, well, actually, that's not necessarily the way to respond. It may well be appropriate for the individual based on their center of gravity, but very often, and Ken writes about boomeritis, it's more an invitation of the expressive self struggling to break through to support the emergence into the first of the second tier stages, which is yellow, a very flex flow, integrated intelligence, and it requires some oomph from the expressive self. And in the early stages, the mind, the body can't work out what the new signature is. So it can often try and label it and interpret it based on previous emotions. But if it's a weak signal from a future, the mind, the body in the early stages cannot differentiate it. So I often say, and this is what we teach, is helping the individual to differentiate between a problem to be fixed and an invitation from their future. Now, cognitively, that's a very, very important freeing up process, because the individual then has more insight to respond to a message for their own evolutionary growth, rather than to be taken to a more psychotherapeutic stance of working with the problem to be fixed.
So how do we help people get out of this kind of green swamp that seems to be emerging in a really strong way? I mean, this for me is the only news story of the last 2 years.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's the boomeritis. It's the love. I often use a phrase by out of a book I read once. It was Jerome K. Jerome, and it's the quote is, "It's love is like the measles. We'll have to go through with it." And remember that one of the challenges in the transition through green is that some of the natural attributes of green are actually contrary to the whole notion of stage development. The being will actually naturally reject any form of hierarchy. So it's if you're watching people like Jordan Peterson at the moment, he really is pushing a few buttons, because he's bringing out the reality that universe, there is hierarchy in universe, and it shows through human expression. And it's like a red rag to a bull to somebody who's in a very center of gravity green transition, because their primary bias in terms of their center of gravity is everyone's equal, equality, the human equity, human equality is the primary signature of their dominant worldview. and they reject any forms of hierarchy. So it's as though nature likes to really test the new expression and give it every challenge possible to demonstrate itself, because I do believe there's an innate intelligence in this creative evolutionary dynamic we're in that nature or the all does not allow anything new to emerge unless it can nurture not only the local interpretation of the universe, but basically contribute to the fulfillment of I suppose, the return to spirit.
And it does seem particularly kind of frustrating when what to me looks like the leading edge, and that could be, cognitively, I think now just intuition, certain people, certain thinkers, or certain people that have a lot of appeal, like, you mentioned Jordan Peterson and other people out there. There's this huge pushback, and that might look like personal attacks, that might look like deplatforming, and some of these are pretty vicious right now. Yeah. It's like the old system doesn't want to go. It doesn't want a new boss in town. Yeah. Like, say something more about that kind of struggle, because that does seem to be the crux of where we're at right now. Some people trying to emerge out of it, while this kind of green kind of seems to be entrenching its power organizationally, governmentally, educationally.
Well, it's a very interesting story. The simile I give it or describe it is, the way I describe it is that it's like there's a membrane between each worldview transition, and it takes a bit of a push to break through in each transition. But this transition to second tier is not just a transition to a new stage. It's arguably a transition to a whole new species, which I think just lifts the conversation to a next level. And what I've learned, and this is through doing lots of practice, both personal and large group intelligence work, such as constellations, what we knew from the research was that in the transition into second tier, the neurochemical signature of the deep brain structures changed radically. So let me explain that. The deep brain structures that were the carrier of this complex adaptive intelligence, which spiral dynamics describes color-coded bays, this survival sense, very instinctual. In the emergence of yellow, that capacity is no longer needed. So that part of the deep brain goes through a major mutation, and effectively some of the lesser needed capacities of age just basically fade away and they don't exist. So in the transition to second tier, the individual loses the capacity for abject fear. Yes, they can be concerned, but they're not at the mercy of those earlier aspects of the driven self. They do not freeze. So we talk about flight or flight. We don't often talk about that freeze effect. So that freeze effect disappears because the capacity for fear disappears in that transition, and it can be very destabilizing. And certainly, I've done constellations that have run for 3, nearly 4 hours, as we witness what it means for the collapse of that particular stage. But then the amazing release of energy, which then the individual has to handle this whole new expressive self. And very often, I believe, one of the greatest barriers to that transition to the green is learning to handle this new power in a way that is a reflection of the unknown rather than echo or a memory of how power has been acted out in the individual's experience personally from cradle through to that stage. So the cognitive side, the use of these models to free the mind up, I think is a really significant part of this transition, along with the somatic, the body embodiment work, and a whole range of others. You take in impressions and practice from as many sources as possible, but learning to choose which practice reflects the upstretched dynamic of your own center of gravity. And that, I think, is probably the most succinct way to answer your question, is choose the approach that meets you where you are next naturally emerging. And very often, it's a post-conventional practice that carries a sort of level of conversation and awareness that you and I are engaging in on this call.
Mm. Yeah, and this idea of choice of practice and the choice reflecting the kind of the better self, the emergent self is an interesting one. Definitely seeing this movement from everything's all good in embodiment, it's all good, baby, to a little more discernment in there.
Yes, yeah, and this is it's human nature. We get caught up in the and don't hear this as negative, but I'm caught up in a lot of our work in agriculture at the moment, in fadism. So a new fad pops up. There's a bit of a surge, and Graves would call it a delta surge, sense of euphoria, move forward, but then it doesn't deliver the goods. The individual lapses back into a problematic state that's worse than if they'd not done the practice in the first place. So it's a palliative care approach rather than, I think you're hinting at, is get to the root cause and learn to shape your own life conditions and that of others that encourages them to meet themselves where they are next naturally emerging into. And that's the basis of all the practice around the original Gravesian work, the conditions for change, the practices that go with an understanding of the change of these complex adaptive intelligences. And that really is the core of the work. The understanding of the stages is the icing on the cake to aid diagnostic and to aid the placement and the creation of life conditions that meets the individual where they are next naturally emerging towards. So every guru, every point of view, every model has a role to play. It's just the skill in placing it, finding it, and from an individual point of view, in this transition, being able to discern what might be best next naturally for you at that given time.
Okay, Christopher, I think I'm going to have to listen to this one back a couple of times, I think, to get the most from this. Is there anything you kind of haven't said yet that you feel is really kind of key to your message here, key to your work? It's getting a little late here, and I'm thinking to wrap this up fairly soon.
Yeah, there was a thought comes from out a few moments, and when it obviously disappeared, but it came back when you asked me the question. For me, what I find most significant, Mark, is that there is certain hope in an uncertain world, that the capacity for us to discover how to handle the complexity of the current situation, that capacity is definitely there. We've just got to find a way of releasing it, utilizing it, and handling the significant consequences of its release, because it means fundamentally that every basic assumption around which we understand and operate our civilization has to be re-examined, to remove the barriers to change, but also to make sure that the solutions we apply today truly lead towards a viability of planet and species. But for me, the real excitement is the realization that actually it was almost inevitable we'd find ourselves in this situation. All species, if you look at the life cycles, they exceed the capacity for their local resources to sustain. What we have as a gift as a species is the capacity to be able to be aware of that and choose to lead a way through. So it's not only our viability on this planet, it's our fundamental future in the universe that it is at stake here. And that's really what I'm curious about, and it really is what maintains and motivates me. And I assure you, it isn't easy at times, because we have to sustain our financial viability in a conventional world whilst handling the vagaries of a post-conventional world, whilst responding to the significant invitation from the post-conventional world.
Christopher, that's a beautiful wrap up there. And if people want to kind of find out more about this, where's the place to go?
The place to go is we have two faces. One is 3LM, www.3lm.network. And the other one is 5 Deep, number 5, followed by the word deep. But if you just post the email, just ask them to get in touch. And certainly, Mark, I do hope we can find ways of collaborating together on the front line. I think it would be great. And I look forward to that opportunity. So that's perhaps how they can find us as well.
Great. I'll put those links on our website as ever. So, Christopher, I'm going to say goodbye here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark. Take care.
some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodifacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. If you're, most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodifacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodifacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.